Murray didn't change his expression. Then Lawson gave the order, "Drop it. Now." And all four Australians instantly did something that looked like surrender. They dumped their packs. They flattened into the ground. They didn't crawl. They didn't shuffle. They didn't even turn their heads. They became dead still. Because Lawson had seen something you only learn after you almost die. In thick jungle, movement is louder than sound. The human eye is drawn to motion like it's wired. A sentry might miss a shape. He won't miss a leaf twitching wrong. And the Japanese scouts moving through that ravine weren't amateurs. They were hunters. If you ran, they'd chase. If you fired, they'd fix you. If you froze, you'd turn the jungle back into noise. The Japanese patrol passed close. Close enough that Riley could see the wet on their boots. Close enough that O'Connor could hear the soft clack of gear. Close enough that Murray could smell tobacco. And Lawson didn't let his men move. Not 1 inch. For a full minute after the patrol passed, Lawson kept them locked. Then only then he raised 2 fingers, up, not standing, not walking, a careful lift, a careful reset. Then they moved again, low and slow. Now, here's why this mattered. In American doctrine, if you see enemy soldiers that close, you engage or you break contact aggressively. You don't just lie there. Because lying there feels like doing nothing. It feels passive. It feels humiliating. It feels like you're letting the enemy get away. But Lawson wasn't trying to kill 4 scouts. He was trying to stop 100 men from hitting the base at dawn. Killing the scouts creates noise. Noise creates search. Search creates focus. Focus creates pressure on the perimeter. Pressure makes the enemy accelerate the assault. Lawson didn't want acceleration. He wanted delay. So he used the most violent thing you can do to an enemy in the jungle. He stole their certainty. And once Lawson's team reached the first outer edge of the staging area, the picture snapped into focus. This wasn't a small patrol. This wasn't a local harassment unit. This was a coordinated formation. Cook sites, listening posts, a command element deeper back, and a clear axis of movement toward the American perimeter. Through the impassable ravine, Lawson didn't need binoculars. He needed one glance at the pattern. They were going to bypass the strong side and hit the seam. And the worst part? The Americans were oriented the wrong way. If the assault came from the expected direction, the base would respond. If it came through the ravine, the Japanese would appear inside the defensive rhythm. That's how bases die. Not by being overwhelmed. By being surprised from a direction the map said didn't matter. Now Lawson had to make the second decision. This one was even harder. Because he could not defeat this force. 4 men cannot fight a battalion. So the goal was never destruction. The goal was disruption. And disruption in the jungle means 2 things. Break the enemy's timing. Break the enemy's communication. If you do that, their numbers don't vanish, but their plan does. So Lawson picked targets that weren't glamorous. Not the big group. Not the loud element. The invisible backbone. First, the forward observer posts. The men watching the perimeter. The ones who would signal go at the right moment. If those posts went silent, the assault timetable slipped. Second, the comms lines. Not by cutting everything and screaming something's wrong. By selectively corrupting the flow. Make messages fail. Make confirmations vanish. Make officers repeat orders. Repeat orders eat minutes. Minutes change dawn. And dawn changes the rules. Because at dawn, a moving force is visible. At dawn, a flank route is no longer a secret. At dawn, an assault loses its greatest advantage. So the Australians became ghosts with a purpose. They moved toward the first listening post. And the jungle tested them again. A Japanese sentry shifted. A boot crushed something that shouldn't crunch. A head turned. And Lawson didn't say, freeze. He didn't say back. He said the same thing again. Drop it. Now. They hit the ground like they'd been shot. Motionless. Breath controlled. Riley's fingers clenched the radio harness, but he didn't move. O'Connor's eyes tracked the blade of grass, and then stopped tracking it, because tracking is movement. Murray's jaw tightened, and Lawson watched the sentry's silhouette hover, then relax. Then pass. When the man was gone, Lawson waited longer than felt safe. Then they moved. That was the point of the Forbidden's move. It wasn't drama. It was discipline. It was the refusal to act on panic. It was the choice to let your ego suffer so your team survives. Now they reached a listening post. A small pair of men, positioned to watch the perimeter approaches. If those men lived, the timetable stayed intact. If they vanished without noise, the timetable became uncertainty. Lawson gave hand signals. O'Connor and Murray flowed forward. Riley stayed back, radio hugged tight, eyes scanning. It happened fast. No shots, no shouting. Just silence, and then the two Japanese silhouettes were gone. Lawson didn't celebrate. He didn't count. He didn't check pockets. He did something else. He moved a small object, something simple, into the space where certainty used to be. Not a trophy. A message. A sign meant for the enemy, not for the Americans. Something that would make a Japanese officer stop and ask a question he did not have time to ask. Because questions are poison in an assault timetable. Now came the hardest part. Communications. The enemy had a network. The Americans did too. But the Americans weren't listening to this network. Lawson's team didn't need to decode the whole system. They only needed to create one effect: hesitation. So O'Connor did what he was best at. He listened. Not for voices. For rhythm. For the pattern of transmissions. For the moments when acknowledgments should return. For the cadence that says, "This is normal." Then he introduced abnormal. Not by blasting fake orders like a movie. By clipping the chain. A message goes out. The reply fails. The sender repeats. The receiver gets the repeat late. Now two people are out of sync. Multiply that across an attack force, and you don't get chaos immediately. You get small delays. And small delays in a coordinated assault create something commanders hate. They create doubt. And while the Japanese were slowing, the American base was still doing what bases do. They were prepping for inspection. They were tightening schedules. They were congratulating themselves on low-risk briefings. And they had no idea the jungle behind the green sectors was full of men eating hot rice and waiting for dawn. Then the first twist hit Lawson. Not from the enemy, from the Allies. Because while Lawson's team was working the enemy's spine, the American base began adjusting its own posture. Sentries shifted. A patrol leader decided to run a quick sweep in the safe ravine because routine demands boxes checked. And that sweep moved directly toward Lawson's team's withdrawal lane. If that patrol stumbled into the Japanese staging area, it wouldn't be a sweep. It would be a trigger. Shots would be fired. The enemy would react. The assault could start early. And the Australians would be trapped between two forces that both considered that ravine secure. Lawson had seconds to decide. He could reveal himself to the Americans and stop the sweep. But revealing himself meant questions. Questions meant radio calls. Radio calls meant command involvement. Command involvement meant delay. Delay meant the base might not believe him until it was too late. Or he could do the ugliest thing. He could let the Americans walk into danger and hope the Japanese stayed disciplined. Lawson didn't hesitate long. He chose a third path. He intercepted the patrol without being seen. He got ahead of them through brush, placed himself where their point man would have to notice something. Without understanding what it was, a faint rustle, a shape, a wrongness, enough to make the patrol pause. Enough for the patrol leader to do what leaders do when nothing looks wrong, but something feels wrong. He turned them back. Not because he'd been told to, because his instincts finally overrode the map. The patrol withdrew, frustrated and confused. thinking they'd avoided a snake nest or a flooded cut. They had no idea they'd avoided the Japanese assault lane by minutes. Lawson didn't exhale relief. He didn't have time, because now the Japanese command element would notice missing posts. They would notice comms gaps. They would tighten. They would hunt. And hunting scouts in the jungle changes the whole environment. When the enemy stops looking outward and starts looking inward, every shadow becomes dangerous. That meant Lawson's team's time window was closing. He had one last target. The command post. Not to wipe it, to scramble it. If he could disrupt the command node, disable radios, break coordination, force officers to relocate, the assault would lose its spine. And that would buy the base the one thing it didn't know it needed: a delay past first light. So Lawson moved, and the jungle punished them for it. Rain thickened. Noise masking improved, but so did tracking mud. The enemy patrols tightened. Fewer gaps, more movement, more eyes. And then Riley, the youngest, made a mistake that almost killed them. A strap snagged. A small metallic tick, not loud, not obvious, but wrong. A Japanese soldier snapped his head. Lawson didn't whisper run. He didn't whisper shoot. He grabbed Riley's harness and slammed him down. Drop it, now. The whole team vanished into the ground again. The Japanese soldier stepped closer. Close enough that Riley could have reached out and touched the man's shin. Close enough that O'Connor could see a strip of cloth tied to the soldier's wrist. Close enough that Murray could count the cartridges on his belt. The soldier stopped. The jungle held its breath. And then the soldier did something terrifying. He didn't move on. He turned slightly and signaled. Two more silhouettes shifted through the brush. They were sweeping, not passing, hunting. If they found the Australians, this became a close-quarters fight in wet darkness against a force that could call more men in seconds. Lawson didn't move. He waited until the last possible moment. Then he did something else the Americans would have hated. He didn't kill them. He redirected them. He created a noise. Far away. A timed snap. A tossed object. A deliberately placed disturbance. The Japanese hunt team turned toward it immediately, because hunters follow motion. They moved off. Lawson waited again long, painful seconds, then lifted two fingers, up, and they slid away like ghosts, leaving nothing behind but wet leaves settling back into place. Now they were close to the command area, and this is where disruption gets risky. Because command posts have guards. Guards have reflexes. Reflexes trigger gunfire. Gunfire triggers the assault early. So Lawson didn't go for the center. He went for the nerves, the antennas, the line junctions, the men carrying messages between nodes. O'Connor listened for a radio burst. Murray watched for movement patterns. Riley prepared to cut and reroute without letting sparks flash. Lawson timed it. Then it happened. Not with explosions, with absence. A radio message went out. It didn't come back. An officer repeated it. The repeat didn't come back. A runner moved to check the line. The runner didn't return on time. The command post's confidence started to crack. And in the jungle, cracked confidence spreads like rot. Because now every unit leader down the line begins asking, is something wrong? And if unit leaders ask, is something wrong? They hesitate. They reposition. They wait for confirmation. And waiting right before an assault kills assaults. Then came the moment that made the victory invisible. The Japanese assault started, but it didn't start like a knife. It started like a stumble. One element moved too early. Another moved too late. Mortar fell wide because coordination between observers and crews was broken. A flank group drifted off its axis because a runner delivered a late correction. From inside the American base, it looked like the enemy was sloppy. It looked like American defensive plans were working. It looked like American readiness and procedure held. It looked like a clean win. But outside the wire, Lawson watched the assault unravel exactly the way he wanted. Not because the enemy was weak, because the enemy was confused. And confusion destroys timing. Timing destroys surprise. And surprise is the real weapon. By the time the sky began to lighten, the assault had failed to penetrate the base. Not because the Americans were brilliant, because the Australians had stolen the enemy's ability to execute. And then, right when Lawson should have felt relief, the worst thing happened. Friendly artillery. The American base, following routine post-contact protocols, began a sweep barrage. A mechanical, clean-the-jungle pattern. Shells walking outward into zones the map still marked as low risk. Zones the Americans believed were empty. Lawson's team was in those zones because the system had already sent them away. So in the American command staff's mind, there were no friendlies out there. And a routine artillery pattern does not ask questions. The first impacts were distant, then closer. Then, close enough that the Australians felt the ground jump. Lawson didn't have time to run. The jungle was saturated. The terrain was a trap. And if they sprinted, they'd expose themselves to anyone still out there. So Lawson did the only thing he knew that worked. He gave the same command again, but this time it wasn't about enemy scouts. It was about Allied steel falling from the sky. Drop it. Now. They flattened. Faces into mud, hands over heads. Mouths open to equalize pressure. A shell landed close. The blast threw wet earth over them. Another landed closer. The jungle snapped and screamed. Riley was behind Lawson, half a step to the wrong side. A fragment came through like a coin thrown by a god. Riley didn't cry out. He just stopped moving. And in the sick silence between blasts, Lawson knew. Not guessed. Knew. The youngest one wasn't getting up. Murray shifted toward him, instinctively reaching. But Lawson grabbed him and held him down because another shell was coming. And this is where war reveals its ugliest truth. The base survived because of the Australians, and the Australians paid for it. Because the base survived. When the barrage finally walked away, Lawson crawled to Riley. There was no dramatic last speech. No cinematic farewell. Just rain, mud, a torn uniform, and a face too young to be still. O'Connor stared into the trees, jaw locked. Murray kept his hands busy, because if he didn't, his hands would shake. Lawson didn't let them stay. Staying invites second chances for death. They secured what they could and moved, silent, heavy, and still unrecognized. Because if they went back to the American base and announced what had happened, the first response wouldn't be gratitude. The first response would be paperwork. And paperwork would ask questions Lawson could not answer without dragging an American commander into shame. Why were you out there? Who authorized this? Why didn't you report? Why weren't you on the manifest? And the most dangerous question, are you saying the Americans didn't stop the assault? Lawson understood the politics instantly. A base that survives before inspection becomes a success story. A success story does not like invisible variables. So Lawson did what ghosts do. He left. The Americans celebrated a clean defense. They wrote a clean report. They credited readiness. They praised procedure. They did not mention 4 Australians who had been told, "This isn't your fight." And Riley's death became a footnote that slid sideways into administrative categories that felt safer. Training accident. Isolated incident. Unrelated. Because friendly fire linked to an embarrassing misunderstanding is not a story institutions like to keep alive. But the jungle always leaves residue. And residue has a way of surfacing. Weeks later, certain anomalies bothered certain people. Why had the enemy assault fractured so strangely? Why did captured notes, if any existed, suggest coordination that never showed up at contact? Why were there comms glitches reported by radio intercepts that didn't match equipment failures? Why did the assault's timing drift across elements like a machine with missing gears? And why did a junior American officer, one of the ones who turned a patrol back from the ravine start, quietly telling the same story to the same kind of people? I don't know why. he'd say. But something stopped us from walking into that ravine. Something felt wrong. Those kinds of comments don't matter to a busy headquarters, but they matter to analysts. And analysts are how the Pentagon eventually heard a whisper, not a formal report, a rumor, a pattern, a story that didn't fit. 4 Australians, uncleared, dismissed, seen at the edge of the base before the assault, then gone, then a strangely disorganized enemy attack, then a friendly fire casualty logged awkwardly far from the action. The Pentagon did what the Pentagon does. It asked for a report, and the field did what the field does. It produced something sanitized, nothing that embarrassed anyone, nothing that admitted the base had been saved by people it had rejected, nothing that suggested a doctrine violation. But one officer, one person, who couldn't let the mismatch go, added a small note in a private channel. It wasn't a confession. It was a question. He wrote about an unorthodox Allied patrol method. He described one repeated detail that kept appearing across second-hand accounts from both Japanese confusion reports and Allied perimeter anomalies. A phrase, a behavior, an instruction. Drop it now. The Pentagon hated it, because in the American military mind, drop had a meaning. Drop gear? That's abandonment. Drop to ground? That's vulnerability. Drop and don't shoot? That's cowardice. And yet the outcome was undeniable. The base survived. The enemy failed. And the pattern matched an uncomfortable conclusion. A handful of soldiers using an avoidance and disruption mindset had done more for survival than an entire perimeter plan built on the wrong assumptions. So the Pentagon tried to translate it. They tried to turn it into a checklist. They tried to formalize it into doctrine language. And they ran into a wall, because the forbiddens move wasn't a trick. It wasn't a gadget. It wasn't a special technique you can teach in a classroom and declare mastered. It was a psychological discipline, the ability to kill your own reflex, to feel danger inches away and choose stillness, to see an enemy and refuse the ego of engagement, to accept looking passive so you can remain lethal later. That is not how big militaries like to define competence. Big militaries like action that can be measured, rounds fired, objectives taken, territory held, kills confirmed. But drop it now produces something harder, a victory that looks like nothing happened. And nothing happened is the hardest kind of success to defend in an institution built on reports. Still, the idea wouldn't die, because people who fight in the jungle remember one thing above all else. The enemy decides what kind of fight you re-in, unless you steal the enemy's ability to decide. That's what Lawson stole, not with bullets, with timing, with silence, with disruption, with the willingness to lie in the mud and let danger walk past. Years later, a different generation would repackage the lesson with new names. Freeze drills, stillness discipline, movement denial, signature management. It would be taught in cleaner facilities by instructors who never had to taste wet jungle soil while a sentry stood a meter away. And the origin story would be blurred, because origin stories always are. Because if you tell the real origin story, you have to admit something that hurts. Sometimes, the correct move looks wrong to the system. Sometimes, the soldier who saves you is the soldier you dismissed. Sometimes, the act that prevents catastrophe is the act nobody sees. And sometimes, the order that changes everything isn't shouted. It's whispered. Drop it. Now. Lawson never became famous for it. Riley never got to go home and tell anyone why he died. The American commander never publicly corrected his story. The base went on as a symbol of readiness, because that's what it needed to be. But in a drawer years later, long after the war moved on and the paper turned yellow one, American officer kept 2 objects he never explained. Not medals, not commendations. a single dull dog tag that didn't match the names in his official report, and a small mud-stained scrap of paper with 3 words written on it in pencil. The words that baffled the Pentagon. The words that saved his base. "Drop it now,"